please chat your name and the organization you're representing, or if you're not representing an organization, give us your full name in chat form so that the person that is keeping track of the chat, when it's time to ask questions, will know your name and will identify what organization you're representing. This is in lieu of what we normally do when we have a meeting in person where everybody stands up and introduces themselves. Tonight, because of the way we're doing this, we're not going to do that. So just chat, send a chat or a text that we are who you are and what organization you're representing. So we have 18 people on the line so far, including myself, and I'm going to turn it over to welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to Alejandra Johnson to introduce our guests.
All right, and Julie, oh, there she is. A lot of faces popping up, and so I couldn't keep track. So, hi, Denise, how are you?
I'm well, how are you?
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm very happy that we're doing this. We have a lot of good people on the line, and we are going to be recording this, everybody. So it will be distributed, and that'll be useful for a couple of different reasons. First off, we will be able to share it with, of course, our members directly, but it will also mean that you will have the link so that you can share it with your own personal network or other people that, I mean, heck, your neighbor, whoever might be interested in this issue right now. And we're very proud to be able to offer this resource because Denise is an expert on the topic. She is a seasoned litigator and currently general counsel for Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. She has held a number of very important roles at both the local and national level, has testified before government on a number of occasions. She does a very important job on the day of. Her jobs are all important throughout the year, but in particular on the day of the election, she coordinates legal volunteers and people who are actually on site, making sure that voting is happening. This is a nonpartisan effort. She doesn't throw up obstacles for some groups and remove them for others. It's a nonpartisan effort to really make sure that everybody has access to the polls. So protecting democracy itself. She's filed class action lawsuits, among many other forms of relevant litigation to keep these issues at the forefront of the courts and moving forward to protect our rights. She's worked with the ACLU, the Advancement Project, currently professor at WashU of Political Science and Law, has received many awards and authored a number of articles and materials in this area. It's really important, I think, to notice Denise's intersectional approach. This is at least the second or third time that she's done outreach with the Latinx community, if not many more times over the years, but I mean just in recent history. The awards she's received are, for example, Martin Luther King Human Rights Awards, Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the American Jewish Congress Democracy and Action Award, the 2009 Spirit of Martin Luther King Community Award. The materials that she puts out are in multiple languages, so her approach is truly nonpartisan, multicultural, and intersectional. I encourage you to look her up. You will have the name already in the email. You can learn more about her and particularly her current effort. If you text the letters MO for Missouri, MO, V as in voter, protection, P, coalition, MOVPC, to the number 66866. Again, that is 66866. You will be able to get her updates, sign up for the weekly phone calls, and stay abreast of this very important information. I encourage you all to at least stay abreast, if not absolutely engage and participate, because this is kind of the lightning rail, if you will. This is the power center, getting people access to voting helps get new laws, new legislators, new policies. It's how change is very much affected. So without further ado, Denise Lieberman, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank
Before,
you.
just a question. Before you go, Denise, sorry to interrupt you. I just want to tell people that just joined our conference that if you have, please introduce yourself on the chat, your name and organization that you represent. And if you have questions, please put the questions on the chat. Those questions are going to be direct to Denise after her speak. Denise, welcome. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Alex, I want to thank you for that incredibly gracious introduction. And I want to thank the Hispanic Leaders Group for inviting me to join your meeting tonight. And it's quite an honor to be here and quite an honor to work in partnership with you. And I want to also give a shout out back to Ms. Alexandra Johnson, who has been a leader in this work, both in her role as president of the Hispanic Bar Association, and really, has helped lead some of the efforts with election protection to ensure that people who have language access issues and other voting issues, particularly in the Latinx community, are able to have full and ready available access to needed services to ensure that they can exercise their right to vote. And I appreciate your recognition of kind of the intersectional approach. In our office, we call it kind of a movement lawyering approach. And really what that means is that, that the work that you do is centered in the leadership and lived experiences of impacted communities. And what we know, of course, is that, and there's so much intersection. We know that communities of color, and in particular Latinx communities, have a sort of compounded barriers that make access to democracy harder, right? And even in particular in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is hitting communities of color so much harder than white communities. And those are the same communities that have less ready access to health care. These are going to be the same communities that are more likely to be essential workers, or also more likely to be service workers that found themselves unemployed as a result of this pandemic, much more likely to be housing insecure. And all of those things tie into access to the vote. So for example, as a result of this pandemic, you're seeing fewer sort of community fairs, community festivals, which is where the bulk of voter registration drives happen. And in particular, what we know is that the census data shows that Latinx communities in particular are twice as likely as white voters to register through a big voter registration drive. And those things are not happening as much. They're more likely to use early voting, particularly in states that have robust early voting, like Sunday voting, are much more likely to participate, like for example, in Souls to the Polls programs, things that we don't have here in Missouri. And of course, they are also much more likely to be disparately impacted by this pandemic. There was a New York Times poll last month that found, it was looking at New York, so this is not Missouri, that found nearly half of New York City voters knew someone who had died of COVID. But when they broke it down based on ethnicity and race, 74% of white voters did not know anyone who had succumbed to the pandemic. 48% of Black voters did, and 52% of Latinx voters knew somebody close to them who had died. So, I'm starting this just by saying that all of these issues, and as we're sitting here in the midst of major protests in this country, these issues are interconnected, and they are about having a voice and building power. And that's what the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is trying to help facilitate. So I've got some slides up. I'll just kind of share some of these with you. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is nonpartisan, and it's a sort of loosely knit statewide network of voter advocates that includes, it's a really exciting coalition, actually, because it includes just a broad range of groups, everybody from like the legal women voters types that you might expect, to student organizations, to disability rights advocates, to seniors, to environmental groups, to researchers, to a whole range of labor, faith, churches, and we work in a variety of areas, including policy advocacy. We've really been on the front lines, urging needed reforms to ensure people can vote safely during this pandemic. Litigation, we're currently in court right now in front of the Missouri Supreme Court. We expect a decision any day in our lawsuit to ensure that voters can vote by mail without a notary this year. A lot of voter engagement, education, we're producing materials, and of course, election protection. And so, for example, among the kinds of materials we produce, so we try and have those translated into multiple languages for people that need language assistance. So this is last year's Palm Card that we're going to tweak this year to have more emphasis on mail-in voting, but we had this translated into 6 languages. This is the card in Spanish. And the election protection hotline as well includes multiple language affinity hotlines. And so while the National Election Protection Hotline 866-R-VOTE gets answered in English, the 888-V-VOTA hotline gets answered in Spanish. And it's attorneys, just like on the other hotline, who are answering calls in Spanish. We also have an Asian languages hotline and an Arabic English hotline as well. Well, this is just a gratuitous photo of some of us. I'm not sure if you're in this one, Alex, or not, from a previous year at the Election Protection Headquarters in St. Louis. And as Alex mentioned, if you are interested in getting some of the email updates, you can text MOVPC to 66866. And so, I started to kind of talking about why I think this is important and why I think these layers all overlap. And really, it's about having a voice. And what we know is that communities whose voices have been silenced, or who are marginalized in numerous other areas of life, have less ability to have their voices heard. And that's why our focus is so dedicated to ensuring particularly that those voices are uplifted, because everybody has a right to have a voice and have a say. I mean, in essence, the right to vote is, and I know a lot of people are thinking this is all about politics and Democrats and Republicans, and do you like Trump or do you not like Trump? I actually think it's about something much bigger than that. I think it's really a moral imperative, because it's about dignity, isn't it? I mean, literally, like, who gets to vote says who counts. Literally, who counts? We count you. And so when particular groups have less access to the vote, or face barriers to being able to vote, it's saying you don't count. And of course, voting is the way to build power. At the very bare minimum, it is how we exercise self-determination over our own lives, in just the things that affect us and our families and our communities on a day-to-day basis. And I fundamentally believe that all people have a right to control their own destinies and have a say and have self-determination over the rules and issues and that affect their lives. And the way we do that in society is through the vote. And that's how we make change happen in communities. And so it's connected to the vote. So specifically, I want to talk about how we're going to vote in the midst of this crisis, particularly a crisis that is disproportionately impacting communities of color. And unfortunately, in Missouri, it's not as easy as it could be. You know, the vast majority of states, 34 states, and actually now, thanks to an order in a couple of states, 36 really, allow anybody to vote absentee without providing a reason. If we had that here in Missouri, we could all be spending our time doing other things. Anybody who felt like they didn't want to go to a polling place on election day because of this pandemic would be able to vote absentee without any hurdles. Unfortunately, Missouri requires voters to have an excuse to vote absentee. Now, there was a new law that was passed, signed by the governor very recently, that does make some a couple of big changes to the law this year. It adds one new category to how you can vote absentee for people who are at risk for COVID, and it also provides that any other voter can vote by mail. But it requires those voters to jump through some hoops, like getting that ballot notarized. So I'm going to cover both and a couple other things. Oops. So here in Missouri, now with this added new excuse, there's 7 reasons that you can vote absentee if you don't want to go to the polls on election day, or you're not able to go to the polls on election day. One is that you're going to be absent from your election jurisdiction. One is that you expect to be incapacitated or confined due to illness or disability, or that you're a caregiver for somebody who is. And that's an important point. So for example, I'm a caregiver for my 89-year-old mother, and she's confined to her home. If you have a religious belief or practice, if you are employed by an election authority, like if you're working as a poll worker, if you are incarcerated, but still retain the right to vote. So keep in mind that if you have not been convicted of a crime, if you're in jail, if you're in pretrial detention, and again, communities of color are much more likely to be unable to make bail and are much more likely to be in that circumstance, they're allowed to vote absentee. If you're in an address confidentiality program, for example, if you through like a domestic violence program or witness protection. And now this new one, if the voter has or is in an at-risk category for COVID. Now what's important here is number 2 and number 7 don't require a notary. So if you expect to be confined due to illness or are caring for somebody, you can vote absentee, no notary required. And for 2020, if you are in an at-risk category for contracting or transmitting COVID, you can vote absentee, no notary required. So who are those people? It actually covers a fairly large swath of people. This means that under this new law, anyone who's at risk who can vote without a notary includes anyone over the age of 65, anyone in a long-term care facility, anyone with chronic lung disease, including people with severe or moderate asthma, anyone with a serious heart condition, anyone who's immunocompromised. So for example, I'm immunocompromised, and so I could actually vote absentee under this provision in addition to the other one. If I wanted, since I'm a caregiver. Anyone with diabetes, anyone with liver disease, anyone who with chronic kidney disease or is on dialysis. And so these are the categories here that do not require a notary. I'm making this clear because getting that ballot notarized is a significant extra hurdle because you have to go out and find somebody to notarize your ballot. In addition to those 2 excuses, people who are on the permanent absentee list, which is not hard to get on actually, and if you have seniors in your life. My mom is now on the permanent absentee list, and it's not because she could never go to the polls, but by and large, she's confined to the home, and she's eligible to get an absentee ballot sent to her automatically. Military overseas voters also don't have to have their ballots notarized. And so that's kind of the big new changes right here, those two things. Is that anyone who's at risk for COVID can vote absentee without getting notarized, and all other voters can vote by mail, but do have to get those ballots notarized.
And Denise, what is the difference between voting absentee and voting by mail?
That's a great question. As a practical matter, very little, but there are a few rules that are a little bit different. And so I created this chart that we can send you over email that kind of spells out the differences. One of the big differences is the notary. There's also a difference in how you have to apply to get the ballot a little bit. Absentee ballots you can request over email or by fax, but mail-in ballots you can only request by sending something through the mail or in person. So here's the steps. I put this down into 4 steps, and then we can stop for questions. So the first step is you have to actually apply for one of these ballots. They're not going to send it to you. And you have to send that application to your local election authority. So for those of you who live in St. Louis City, that's going to be the St. Louis City Board of Elections. If you live in St. Louis County, like Maplewood or Clayton or Florissant, you're going to send that to St. Louis County Board of Elections. Now, absentee requests can be sent by email or by mail or by fax or in person, but the mail ballot requests can only be sent by mail or in person. The other big thing to remember is that it has to be signed. So here's what the actual form looks like. And you could see sort of both are on there. So there's the absentee request. You have to check one of the boxes. If you don't meet one of those, then you can check the box for a mail-in ballot. But you do have to sign that bottom piece there. Now, this form is available online and it is fillable online. And there are a number of jurisdictions that allow you to do an electronic signature and just email that in. So step 2, you got to, after you fill out this form, you have to send it in. And these are the deadlines. And this is important because these deadlines are the day that the application has to be received, not the day that it has to be postmarked, which is kind of confusing. So for the August primary, you have to get that request for your absentee ballot in by July 22nd. And for November, you have to get it in by October 21st. Now keep in mind, absentee voting starts 6 weeks before Election Day. And you can also just go and vote absentee in person at the election board, starting 6 weeks before Election Day. So for August, that'll be starting June 23rd. And while it is going somewhere, it's not the same as being kind of in a line in a crowded polling place, because it's a little easier to practice social distancing. So then after you send that application in, assuming that it's been signed, if you don't sign it, you're not gonna get a ballot back. They'll mail you a ballot back. You cast your ballot. It looks like a little Scantron form. You put it into a secrecy envelope, and then you put that into an outer envelope that has a form on it. And the form looks a little bit like the application. You have to state your name, and you basically are attesting like, yes, I'm me, I'm eligible to vote. Here's, I'm voting absentee or I'm voting by mail, and you have to sign it. Now, in some of those cases, that ballot, you're gonna have to sign it in front of a notary, right? Now, in the cases we talked about earlier, you don't have to sign it in front of a notary. Once you complete that ballot, just stick it in the mail and you're good to go. But if it's a mail-in ballot right now, you will have to sign it in front of a notary. So once you fill out that form, you want to get it back to the election board. And this is the deadline. This is another one of those things where it has to be received by the close of polls on election day, not postmarked. It's also important to know that if for some reason, like you miss this deadline to request an absentee ballot, you can still go, and even if you requested the absentee ballot, you can still go and vote absentee in person until 5 p.m. on Monday before election day. So, and frankly, you can also, even if you requested an absentee ballot, if you never filled it out or if you didn't get it in the mail in time, you can just take it with you to the polls, spoil it, and vote in person if you want to. So that's there's a lot of kind of complicated rules here, and that's what makes it a little bit different for the two things that make it different: mail-in ballots from absentee. Absentee can be requested by email, mail ballots can't, and mail ballots have to be notarized. So that could change though, because part of our lawsuit that we filed on behalf of the NAACP and League of Women Voters argues that requiring people to go out and get ballots notarized would be unconstitutional in the midst of the pandemic. Like I said, we argued before the Supreme Court on Monday. We do expect a ruling possibly this week that could affect the notary requirements. And so in the meantime, though, we have created a notary hub where people can sign up. And so anybody that is a notary can sign up. People that want to become a notary can sign up. And then groups that are organizing events to notarize ballots that need notaries to volunteer sign up. And so what we're going to do then is post all those activities and events and hook up the notarization events with the people who are notaries and let them connect with one another. I can stop there. I do have other pieces as well talking about Clean Missouri and the census that I can speak to as well. But I also want to be sensitive to time and taking questions and allowing discussion. So I will follow your lead.
Well, I think, I don't know, we can ask the group, but we have a group of fairly active people here. And so I know that you've given us a great presentation here, particularly for our purposes. My guess is, as I'm seeing everywhere, wanting people to become notaries, particularly with language skills that can assist people who have that barrier get their ballots notarized, because that's just another type of poll tax, right? Or a literacy test, the modern day form of voter disenfranchisement efforts that go back to the beginning. So let's go ahead and, I mean, let's let the group mine your brain, pick your brain on whatever issues they might have. So guys, Mauricio had asked that you submit your questions via chat. And if you could take a moment to do that.
Oh.
One thing right off the bat, while people are maybe typing, and I will kind of moderate the chat on that front, you did say that if you got your absentee ballot late or for some reason had not been able to mail it, you could take it, vote in person, and spoil it. Can you just very briefly explain what spoiling means?
Sure, that's a great question, Alex. Yeah, so it's actually something that you have a right to do at the polling place too. If you're at the polls and you make a mistake on your ballot, you're not forced to live with that. You can say, oh, I made a mistake, and you spoil the ballot, meaning you just turn it in, they give you a new ballot. Well, the same is true with an absentee ballot as long as you have not already cast it, right? And so if you requested that absentee ballot in the mail and you never got around to filling it out, or you never got around to mailing it in, and you still have it with you, take it with you, and you can spoil that ballot and get a brand new ballot and vote right there in person. If you don't have it anymore, what they have at the polling places, they'll get a list. Those poll workers will get a list of all of the people that had submitted absentee ballots, like basically up until the day before election day. And so they'll be able to see, oh yeah, you're not on that list. We don't have a ballot from you. Now, if you are on that list, you're not going to be able to vote in person because you can't vote twice, right? Now, if you don't have the ballot to turn in and spoil, what they'll likely make you do is cast a provisional ballot that then they would check to make sure that your absentee ballot never showed up so that you can't vote twice.
Gotcha. So we do have a couple of questions coming in, and thank you for clarifying that spoiling issue. In terms of the caregiver, so one of the words that I noticed in the language was you can vote absentee if you are a primary caregiver. And, how is that defined? For example, a spouse who has an immune disorder and the other spouse is the caregiver. It sounds like they'd be able to vote absentee if they're the primary caregiver. I know Tony and his wife are the primary caregiver, the only caregivers. But take me, for example, I take care of my mom Mondays from 3 to 8 p.m. and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. So, that's whatever many hours that is per week, but would not consider myself a primary caregiver. Can you talk a little bit about that qualification there?
Yeah, it's not further defined in the statute, and the law doesn't require you to say, well, I care for her this many hours a day. Really what you have to do, there it is. You just have to check one of the boxes, okay? And it does largely leave it to your discretion to decide if you fit into one of those categories, right? So, I'm at my mom's house every day, but I don't sleep there, and we have a home health aide that comes. So, am I a primary? Yeah, I feel like I am. I'm there a lot. I've gotten this question. I got a question recently from someone that was like, well, myself and my sister and my dad, all care for my mom. Are we caregivers? It's ultimately up to you to kind of decide. Now, I will say this, it is illegal to lie on this form, but there has to be, you can't get prosecuted for lying on the form unless there's a basis to believe that you have lied and that you intended to lie, right? And remember, it also has to do with what do you expect? Since you're requesting an absentee ballot ahead of time, it's the same thing, you can get an absentee ballot if you expect to be absent from your election jurisdiction on election day. Right. If it turns out you didn't go out of town, then that's okay, because, I expected that I might have to go out of town for work. Turns out I didn't. I still could validly request an absentee ballot because of that, because I validly expected that might be the case.
And I noticed you pointed out the actual language on the request, and it says, including caring for a person who is incapacitated. So the actual request doesn't include the word primarily. That's interesting. So, in that sense, the form itself may provide us a little bit of language. So
and just on that piece as well, this is from our lawsuit. What we have argued is that that people who are engaged in social distancing to avoid contracting or spreading COVID-19, which is an illness, can reasonably say they expect to be confined due to illness. That is the question that is now before the Missouri Supreme Court, is whether now the state of Missouri says, well, I think you have to actually be ill to use this. Saying, well, COVID is an illness. Many people who are carriers may not be symptomatic. There's lack of widespread testing in this state. It's very easy to transmit it. The health experts advise us to confine ourselves due to this illness. So we'll see. The Missouri Supreme Court could kind of interpret this language broadly. But note that both that and number 7, which is the at-risk factors, allow a pretty broad range of people to be able to vote without a notary, because those at-risk categories include anyone that meet any of those criteria.
That is true. That is true. And we do have some more questions coming in. So I'm going to kind of consolidate one theme that I'm seeing, and that is that voting is not necessarily the way to achieve change, particularly in Minneapolis and in the context, of course, of the electoral vote. I also want to point out before we continue that Cecilia from Red Latina is going to try to translate this, which will be very helpful, and get this out in language and multiple languages via social media strategies is another theme. So 2 things, and then we'll probably get to the point of having to wrap up, but we'll try to fit in as many questions as possible. Is voting a way to achieve change in light of the Electoral College and tragedies such as the murder of Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis? And secondly, multiple languages, strategies, and how to get this out to ethnic communities.
Such a good question. I mean, ultimately, change, comes from building power in communities that have historically not had power or been rendered voiceless. And voting is one way to do that. It is not the only way to do that. And but it is one way to do that. And I think there's some powerful examples. I think, protest is one way of having a voice, right? But it has to lead to further action. And if you don't have a vote, then it's hard to impact policy change because leaders don't have to be accountable to you. And when you have a vote, then leaders have to be accountable. And I think that in combination, protest, education, and voting can lead to systemic change. And just looking right here in our own communities, right? You look at the uprising in Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed in 2014, and within a couple of years, 2 years later, voters elected the first African-American prosecutor in St. Louis County, ousted a 30-year incumbent prosecutor who refused to indict the police officer who killed Mike Brown. This year, just last week, or I don't even know what day it is anymore, 2 weeks ago, whenever we had municipal elections, the city of Ferguson elected its first Black mayor, right? So I think there really is power in the vote, at the least of which it's because there's accountability there, and it gives you the ability to build power in communities, but it alone is not sufficient. With respect to, getting stuff out into ethnic communities, I absolutely 100% agree. First, we want to make sure that people know that the Spanish language hotline is there, that VA Vota is available. And so helping get that word out about that hotline is really important. Getting as many of these materials translated into languages so that people have language access and can fully access information that they need to, because that information is power. And these little cards, you know, you can carry those into the polls, and it gives you empower, it gives you entitlement, it gives you the right, you know, it gives you an ability to assert your rights. And what we find is that people say, no, you know what, I understand that I can vote in this circumstance here, you know, and I'm not going to leave here until I do. And I've got a lawyer on the phone. I've got Alex Johnson on the phone, right? Who's going to help make sure that I'm able to vote. So I think these materials are powerful, but, you know, being in communities and having these conversations, getting them into places where people are, you know, not expecting people to come to you, you know, getting these into churches, and getting these into barbershops, getting these into, I mean, this year's a little challenging because some of the sort of traditional things that we think about, like I said, these voter registration drives, these big group activities, like just aren't really happening. So we have to sort of rethink how we communicate, but it's, I think, incredibly important to be grounded in the communities and allow the community leaders to decide what makes the most sense in communicating with their members. I mean, my job, I have like this narrow little like field of expertise that I can contribute something, but I'm not here, you know, the community leaders should be the ones who decide what their needs are, what the community's needs are, and the people in the community should be able to decide. And if there's any way the stuff that we have can be helpful in that, then that's what we want to support.
Yes, that's wonderful. And, you know, I mean, for me, that definitely, you know, one of the reasons why I work with you is as an attorney is because that getting that vote, that voice to be heard, we saw in 2018 where the court had actually ordered a certain thing, and local election officials in St. Charles, which, you know, you were doing that work, and I actually personally spoke to some of them. They were not disenfranchising light-skinned folks, right? I mean, they were mostly, there were people, Hispanics that I was speaking to who were, you know, talking about problems that they had, being turned away, being asked for voter IDs, or the ID form that they had, which actually was in full compliance, not being accepted, so improperly rejected. And they were, it was without a doubt, you could see the pattern that they were, I mean, there were general things happening, like power was out, they ran out of ballots, those things that were happening, voters across the board. But when it wasn't kind of a logistical or mechanical issue, if it was an election official, you could absolutely see the pattern. When it was a human individual making the decision, you could see the pattern with who they were disenfranchising and who they were not. So that is, I think, when you look at Mike Brown, that's a fantastic example of Mr. Floyd's murderers being taken to, you know, being held accountable, and that's the prosecutor's job in most places. That is an elected position. So I know that there are cases, we are not anti-police, I'm not anti-police, but that when there are certain cases, it's very clear that something bad has happened. The person that makes that call is the prosecutor, and that is most often an elected position. There may be some tiny little townships where it's not, but generally it is an elected position. So I just want to make sure that we have gotten everybody's questions. There is one important one, the citizenship process. Is that, does that ever include an automatic voter registration, to your knowledge?
So no, we don't have automatic voter registration in Missouri. A number of states do, over a dozen states do. And it allows just your existing interactions with government to flow into the voter registration process. There's no reason not to do it. But as you saw from our absentee voting rules, we're behind the curve on a lot of things. there's actually a ballot initiative that we're looking to move in 2022 that would allow that in Missouri. So no, but there are voter registration materials available at naturalization ceremonies. But I will say that because of COVID-19, this was a program that the League of Women Voters has been kind of holding. I know there's volunteers from lots of, the International Institute does it too. But now they can't go to what they would do is show up at naturalization ceremonies, cheer everybody on and then go, here's a voter registration card. You're eligible to register. And they can't go to those ceremonies anymore. And so that in-person, like, hey, register, isn't happening. Now, what I'm being told is that the forms are still there, but I have not been to a naturalization ceremony since all the lockdowns have been in place. But, the law does require you to be a citizen in order to register to vote here in Missouri. I'll note that has not always been the case in America. And there are even some local communities that allow non-citizens to vote, particularly communities that have very large immigrant populations with children. There's some boroughs in New York, for example, that allow those folks to vote in school board races because their kids are absolutely impacted by this. And throughout the rising of America, there were times where they were trying to encourage, westward migration of, Western European immigrants from like Germany and stuff. That's why Missouri has so many Germans in it. And to encourage that, they allowed non-citizen voting at various points. Even this sort of notion that citizenship is a precursor to voting is not necessarily always, necessarily has to be the case. What is clear is that we do know that communities of color, in particular Latinx communities and African American communities, are disparately impacted by the range of voting restrictions that are out there. And it's no coincidence that it's those very communities, especially Latinx communities, that are the largest growing populations in America. That's why those communities are more likely to be subject to purges, more likely to have IDs scrutinized, more likely to have, the whole range of things. And so I'm going to sort of end by saying, because I didn't get to the part of my presentation about the census, but that's why the census is so important. And I know particularly immigrant communities are very scared. I mean, if you are part of a community that has had a history of being persecuted, scrutinized, watched, disproportionately arrested, disproportionately questioned about your legitimacy, it's understandable that you don't really want to answer questions from the government, right? The census is anonymous. None of that information can be used for any sort of criminal prosecution, tax purposes, anything like that. But what it does do is it makes sure that jurisdictions are counted for purposes of representation. And when they're undercounted, that means fewer representatives in Congress, fewer representatives in the legislature, fewer dollars that come in for things like roads, schools, school lunches, healthcare, the whole gamut. And so another really big piece of this is to encourage particularly undercounted communities. And we know that, that communities of color are significantly undercounted. And so then it's just like another layer of underrepresentation on top of it all. So I strongly urge folks to help make sure that communities fill out those census forms.
And jumping right in on that with our last question, are there materials ready for distribution to our contacts, or are we waiting for updates? Where are we with that?
Well, since this court ruling could change whether we have to have ballots notarized, and I expect that ruling like by the end of the week, I am waiting for that to happen. And once this court ruling comes down, we'll know what rules we're going to be working under, because, I don't want to send stuff out. I mean, even that form that I've sent out says, oh yeah, it has to be notarized. It does now, but we don't want to do mass production of materials that are
Might be
wrong.
wrong. That might be
Yeah.
wrong. Right. Well, thank you so much. We have a fantastic group. I see Rafi from, I'm not going to call everybody out, but I do see Rafi from Illinois. We have, I think, someone from KC I saw earlier, a great group of leaders, wonderful activists here. We have Red Latina. I don't know, Ceci, how many people she reaches, but she reaches a good portion of the Latino community locally and in the region, really. So a wonderful, wonderful crowd. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Denise, for your wonderful expertise and outreach efforts and your just constant, nonstop, ever ready bunny. I will litigate till the day I die and save democracy one lawsuit at a time. Wonderful advocacy on behalf of democracy. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I think Mauricio's raising his finger, so I will close out. I very much appreciate everybody being here and spreading the word. Don't forget to text MOVPC for Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, MOVPC to 66866 so that you can stay abreast of this and share it with all of our networks. We've seen these horrible statistics, 48% of Latinx, 52% of African American, actually I think it's the inverse, 50%, that means 1 out of 2 in our community knows somebody who has been affected or perished by the virus. Only 74% of white people did not. Did I quote that correctly, Denise? 74% of white people, 3 out of 4, so only 1 out of 4 white person knows someone, 1 out of 2, double that in the Latinx community, knows a voter who, or voters know somebody who's been affected by this. This is clearly a disparate impact, and also for African Americans. So this is something that as leaders, we really need to address. Mauricio?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first, thank you, Denise, again. And I'm gonna give the word for Tony to do some closing over here. Is it okay if I do that, Alex?
Yes, wonderful.
Thank you for facilitating this session. Very good indeed. And Tony, now it's all yours.
I cannot hear Tony.
Tony, you are mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I got it now. Thank you, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Denise Lieberman for coming in and taking time to be with the Hispanic group, Hispanic Leaders Group and its members. And I want to thank the members for coming on. I know that these are unprecedented time. Doing things by Zoom doesn't always work out with your schedule. So I really appreciate the time that every single one of you have taken out to be on the Zoom. That tells me that the leadership out in the community, which are you guys, the leadership, are doing the things that they need to do in these times. Denise is a tremendous advocate, like Alejandra said, like I'm sure there's 1,000 other people that can tell us stories about Denise and how she works and how she lays down the law. So we thank you again. We can't thank you enough. I wanted to make sure that everybody that wanted to say something said something. And I also wanted to welcome Mrs. Angela Mosley. This is the first time she has been to a general membership meeting. She was with us at Hispanic Capital Day. If her husband is a state representative, Jay Mosley, and Angela is going to be on the ballot. I think it's in the primary, and she's from Florissant. Woo-hoo, Florissant. And so I just want to give her a nice warm welcome. You have her name, reach out to her, Google her, reach out to her. And like Denise said, we need to change the landscape. We need to have the power. We have a lot of good things going for our community. We work hard. We create businesses, which in turn creates employment. We have a lot of these talents that makes up the fabric of America, but we don't have the power we should have. And that's going to start with us electing the officials that conform to our ideas and our values. We need to make sure that we level the playing field. And all you leaders out there, I mean, I am so proud to be in St. Louis. A lot of people throughout the United States really don't know the jewel that we have here. They really don't know the quality of the people that we have here. So we're small but mighty. And I really believe that. And take it from me, somebody that was born in the big city of New York and has traveled throughout Asia and a few states here in the United States. This is a very special town, and the leaders are very special in this town. I can compare some of the community leaders here with some of the community leaders in other places where I've been, and you guys really do a good job, and you're very passionate about the work that you do. So I can ramble on about you guys. I can ramble on about the stuff that we do, but I just want to let you know that I am grateful for everybody coming on our Zoom. I think we did a good job. We had at one time over 27 participants, which is very good. So thank you. And Mauricio, you can close the meeting since you are the administrator.
Well, this is a general meeting, so I just want to take a moment to thank Tony for all of his efforts with the masks. Thousands and thousands of masks that Tony has, as a part of a team effort, has been responsible for collecting somehow and distributing to the community. That is, of course, in the context of a pandemic that is killing more Latinos and Black folks. That's obviously an intersectional area where we can work together. And thank you, Tony, for that. Round of applause on Zoom for Tony and all of those efforts.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
I think people don't know what Tony did. Tony, you collected 100,000 masks with the St. Louis County, and you start donating those masks to the Santa Cecilia Church, to Casa de Salud, Affinia Healthcare, and other organizations. So that's what Alex is talking about. It's an exceptional thing you are doing for the HLG and the community. Congratulations.
Congratulations. Not performative at all. Not performative. Actual impact. Actual impact. So wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Very good meeting. Love your efforts. Keep it up.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.